In the previous video, we implemented the insert method with the retrieval of the produced messages. In this one, we will look at the load, update, and delete methods. We had left off needing to change the name of this attraction to give it an existing one. In other words, we want to update this attraction from the same web panel using the business component from which we inserted it in the previous video. So, from the event for the update, we call our panel, passing it the update mode and the ID of the attraction we want to modify. When this panel receives that mode in the mode variable, we will first need to load the business component variable with the values of the attraction ID received as a parameter. Clearly, we need to load it from the database. For this, we have a method, specifically the load method of the business component. This method receives a parameter that corresponds to the identifier of the business component's transaction. In our case, it will correspond to a value of the attraction ID attribute. So if we execute a load for attraction ID 8, what the method will do is look up the table, attraction for a record with that ID value. If it finds it, then it will load the variable with all the retrieved data. If it doesn't find it, it will return an error message that we can check if we request the generated messages, as we did before. Or instead, we could simply check if the operation was successful to know whether the load was completed successfully or not. So, when the received mode is update, we need the load method to be executed. We can program this in the start event. When writing the method, we see that IntelliTip informs us that it can receive two different types of parameters. One is the primary key, and that's the only one we'll look at here. We won't look at the other variant. We could, for testing, display a message on the web panel indicating whether the load was successful or not. We could even retrieve the messages and display them. Let's try it. Let's request to update this one. Alright, we see that it brings in the loaded data and the success message. There are no messages in the message collection. Let's see what happens if we change the received ID parameter to a non-existent one, like 50. The fail message appears, all the other fields are empty, and in the message collection there's an error for primary key not found. That's not going to happen in our case, because this web panel is invoked from WordWith, so we're sure the ID exists. So we can remove all of this. Alright, but up to now, we've done the load. The user sees the data on the screen. Can they modify all this data or just some of it? What we need to implement now is that when the user presses the button, it updates in the database this record with the values that the business component variable now has. So let's go to the buttons event and add the case where the mode variable receives the mode. Update. We'll change this if to a do case, which will be more convenient for us. In this case, what we need to do is simply call the update method of the business component. It's as simple as that. As we can see, the method also returns true or false, depending on whether it was successful or not. What we can do is perform the commit in case of success. Notice that we will also retrieve the messages in this case. Let's run it. Let's update this attraction. We assign it an attraction name, but we change the category to a non-existent one and the city to a non-existent one. And we confirm. We get these errors about non-existent, not found foreign keys. And nothing changes. If we go back to WorldWith, we see that the record is just as it was. Let's try again. Thank you. But let's just change the name. And in that case, the city to an existing one like number 2, for example, Sao Paulo. Now, when we confirm, it tells us that the update operation was successful. And if we go to world width, we see the modified data. And if we now want to delete this attraction, it will be very easy. By pressing the delete option for the row in the grid, we will call our web panel, passing it the delete mode. Our web panel, which will receive the attraction ID, will first need to load that attraction. So here we can add an OR. With this, we make sure that the data of the attraction received as a parameter will be loaded on the screen so the user can see it. What we want to do in this case is delete that attraction. So, upon confirmation, we need to achieve that behavior. Let's then program the case where the mode variable received as a parameter has the value turnMode.delete. We will simply call the delete method. As we can see here, unlike the insert and update methods, the delete method does not return anything. Therefore, we can't perform the operation and check its result, as we did in those other cases. But we always have the success method available, or its opposite, fail, to check whether the last operation performed on the VC was successful or not. If it was successful, then we execute commit. Let's try it. First, let's run the Tor transaction. We can see that Tor1 has attraction 1 among its attractions, for example. So, what will happen if we try to delete it using the business component? Here, it loaded it with the load method. And now we press confirm. We see that an error message was generated due to referential integrity control. Since there is a record in another table referencing this, deletion is not allowed. On the other hand, if we try to delete the one we created a while ago, it does allow it. On this wiki page, you can find some of the most common messages that may appear as a result of executing one of the operations of CRUD. In our example, we retrieve the messages and simply display them on the screen in a grid. But we can loop through that collection in code and do something with each item. For example, in our case, it would be more interesting if, when the operation doesn't fail, nothing is shown and it simply returns to the work with. But if there is an error, then the error messages are displayed, but not in a grid. Instead, they appear at the top of the screen, and only the error messages. Here we obtain them. Now what we need to do is loop through the collection of items. We do this with the foreign command. For each message in the messages collection, we will need to define this variable message. First of all, what data type will it be? It will be of the items of this SDT. That is, of the data type messages.message. So, for each message in that collection, we are going to execute the message command and ask it to display the description member of the SCDT. If we only wanted to display error type messages, then we would do this. Notice that we could place get messages directly here. We no longer need to store the collection in a variable. Let's review. If the CRUD operation failed, for each message in the collection returned by this method, if it is of type error, then we display its description on the screen. If not, we do nothing. And if the CRUD operation did not fail, then we return to the caller. Alright, and if we want the user to be able to cancel the operation and go back to the work with, we can add a button. Let's run it. If we try to insert an attraction with this name, with category 200, country 200, city 200, we see the 4 error messages. Let's close. Now let's modify this attraction by changing its city to number 1, which we know exists. It's Rio de Janeiro. It did it successfully and returned to worldwide. Let's try to delete attraction 1. It shows us that the deletion is not valid. In this set of videos, we learned that we could perform CRUD operations in code in 2 ways. 1. Through the business component's data type, which is obtained from the transaction, preserving its data structure, the integrity controls for that data, both referential and uniqueness, and the rules and events that do not depend on the screen. And 2. Using the specific CRUD commands, which are only valid in procedures. This involved the new command for insertion, for each with direct assignment to the attributes for update, and for each with delete for deletion. But in these cases, the only control performed is uniqueness, which makes it a faster solution, but also a less complete one. We also pointed out that while this solution can only be implemented in procedures, as we saw with this small example, in the case of the solution with business components, since it is a data type derived from the transaction, variables can be defined for it and loaded either through the screen or by code. And the CRUD operation can be performed. Through a method, these variables are not limited to being used only in a procedure type object. They can also be used, as we saw, in code sections of other objects, such as in the events of a web panel. And so, what was the natural implementation of the workwith, automatically built by GeneXus, with the pattern applied to the transaction? We were able to emulate it for purely didactic purposes with 2 web panels. One acting as the www attraction was our www attraction custom, and the other acting as the transaction. In the latter, we used a business component variable, thank you, whose members the user filled in on the screen and not through code in order to then trigger the CRUD operation from the confirm button event. Clearly, it doesn't make sense to emulate what the transaction already does with the pattern. Here, we just wanted to show the power of the business component, which can be used for much more varied scenarios, such as, for example, creating a data provider that returns a collection of the attraction business component, loaded with some attractions. So, in some object like a procedure or web panel, among others, we could define a collection variable of the attraction business component and assign it the result of the data provider invocation, and then iterate through it with a simple attraction business component variable, attempting to insert each attraction. Thank you, and committing. We could also apply the insert to the entire collection, which would be equivalent to what we are doing here, iterating through it in code and inserting item by item. Within the same code, we could insert a new category by using a variable of the data type, the business component of the category transaction. And in case of success, we could, for example, go through the attractions table. And for each attraction in Beijing, let's suppose that had historical site as its category, change it to the new one. And we can do this with the attraction business component, as shown here, which will ensure that the rules are triggered and all referential integrity and uniqueness checks are enforced. What we've seen here is just a small sample of what can be done with business components.